It's, quote, across just 5 funds, we approximate that BlackRock has invested more than $429 million in PRC companies that pose national security risks to and act directly against the interest of the United States. Joining me right now is Wisconsin Congressman, chairman of that House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party, Mike Gallagher. Mr. Chairman, it's great to see you this morning. Thanks very much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I want to ask you about this this inquiry and what you're looking to find out from BlackRock and MSCI.
Well, one thing I think we can all agree on, Democrats and Republicans, and this is a bipartisan investigation, as well as the American people, I think, agree on this, is that American dollars should not be funding the Chinese Communist Party's military buildup. We should not be building the CCP's techno-totalitarian surveillance state. We should not be funding its gross human rights abuses. And that's why we have opened this bipartisan investigation. We did just a brief review of just a few of MSCI and BlackRock's indices. And this revealed that these companies facilitate American capital flows to dozens of blacklisted PRC companies. We found that MSCI and BlackRock have invested in companies that produce the CCP's military aircraft, its aircraft carriers, its aerospace technology, its artillery shells, and even its advanced nuclear technology. They've invested in companies like BGI Genomics, which collaborated with the Chinese military to collect genetic data on foreign persons without their consent, and other companies found to be complicit in supporting forced labor and human rights abuses in China. So the bottom line is, we believe that your pension, your kids' college endowment should not be funding America's foremost adversary, and that's what's happening. We are at risk of funding our own destruction, and particularly as we figure out how to legislate guardrails on outbound capital flows, this investigation is meant to find the facts that will inform that legislative action.
Well, this is a really important investigation. You should know that we have been talking about this very issue for years. I have had a pet peeve about the fact that the thrift fund, this is the 401k for government employees, has this whole opportunity to buy into these Chinese companies. But doesn't this start with the Biden administration? Doesn't the Biden administration now have a duty to ensure that people understand this? Why is it that these companies are, some of these companies are sanctioned and they're still in these lists and they're still in these indexes?
Well, the Biden administration has been sitting on an executive order for outbound capital flows for months now. My fear is that because there's been this renewed push for diplomatic and economic engagement with the Chinese Communist Party, which, by the way, has produced nothing thus far besides more enhanced CCP aggression, that they are not only delaying it, though we now have reports that'll come out next week, but that it's been significantly. So the Biden administration does need to take a better lead on this issue, but that doesn't absolve us in Congress from acting. We, I believe, need to legislate this issue. There are different constructs out there right now, but I believe that the principle of preventing us from funding our own destruction, particularly in key sectors, a sector-specific approach, is something that a lot of Republicans and Democrats could get behind. And as far as these lists and the way that companies like this get away with it, the fact is they're not doing anything illegal. Congress, there are loopholes that are being exploited. Yeah. Congress needs to close this loophole and at a minimum ensure Americans are not knowingly or unknowingly funding the CCP's genocidal totalitarian ambitions.
Well, I mean, look at some of the venture capital firms out there that are, in fact, encouraging American investors to put their money in Chinese companies that may very well, in the years ahead, turn their guns against America. I asked President Trump about this. He was on this show 2 weeks ago, and I asked him about this very issue, and even he did not, and he was among the most tough that you could see as far as recent presidents on China, but even he did not go to the capital markets route. Watch this. Would you be prepared to attack the economic relationship that we have with China? For example, the capital markets are wide open for communist China, and unwitting investors are basically funding the expansion of the CCP. Would you put limits in place in terms of what Americans can buy?
So I did something better. I did tremendous tariffs. We took in hundreds of billions of dollars, tariffs and taxes. So when China, which was just dumping everything into our country, steel and everything. You know, they were dumping steel at a level that was going to put our steel mills out of business, which is what they wanted. I saved the steel industry. We were dead. And I taxed a 50% tax on dumping steel. And then they start sending it through other countries, and we caught them. And they start sending it through Canada.
So why is everybody so afraid to put limitations on investor capital going into Chinese companies that could work against America?
Well, I would submit, and with all due respect to the former president, that the tariff issue doesn't solve the outbound capital flow problem. And we need to consider all capital outflows to China, public and private. Any outbound regulation that focuses only on venture capital and private equity, but exempts public market products like ETFs, mutual funds, and individual stocks, in my opinion, will fail to address the national security threat, because the private market investments represent only 15% of total U.S. capital investments in the PRC companies. Here's what's actually going on behind the scenes here. As you know, I mean, you know how D.C. works. Right now, there's an aggressive lobbying effort on behalf of Wall Street to water down any restrictions that the Biden administration or Congress might enact. All the more important why we need to build off the foundation of this bipartisan investigation and not allow the special interests, not allow the high-paid lobbyists to get in the way of what I think is common sense legislation. By the way, what happens to your investment in China when the CCP makes a move on Taiwan and tries to take it by force? There are systemic risks involved to doing business in China that range from having your assets seized in the event of a Taiwan scenario to the inherent risks of things like variable interest entities for which there are no shareholder protections. So we are long overdue for taking action. And whoever the presidential candidate is, my hope is that this will be an issue in the primary. This is a key issue. Every single Republican presidential candidate should be forced to take an issue on this. For me, this is an absolutely essential issue.
I totally agree with you, Congressman. And I want to ask you, I mean, what is the incentive for BlackRock not to steer investor flows into these companies? Let's face it. I mean, they want that relationship with Beijing. Are you going to ask Larry Fink how much money he manages for the Chinese Communist Party? Is he managing money for Xi Jinping?
This is just the start of our efforts, and my hope is that BlackRock will cooperate. I think that it is in their own interest to get rid of a lot of these companies that are in the ETFs or that track the MSCI. The risks are just too great, the reputational risks. And as we've talked about before, Maria, particularly when you consider what else BlackRock has been lecturing us about, which is so-called ESG investing. Obviously, the Chinese Communist Party is terrible when it comes to the E, to the S, and the G. And if the G stands for anything, it should stand for genocide.
Great point. So this is why we keep asking whether or not Joe Biden is compromised, because we do not understand this soft approach. Now the administration's reportedly searching for potential Chinese malware targeting U.S. global military operations. One congressional official telling the New York Times the malware is essentially a ticking time bomb that could give China the power to interrupt or slow American military deployments or resupply operations by cutting off power, water, and communications to U.S. military bases. Congressman Gallagher, I mean, this is really serious stuff here, and we've got Wall Street wanting to make billions on it. Let me get your take on this threat here. Why do we keep sending cabinet members to Beijing? Now we understand Gina Raimondo is going next. We had Janet Yellen, we had John Kerry, we had Treasury, Janet Yellen, as I just mentioned, Anthony Blinken, and we keep going to pray and beg for communications, and they're just getting serious about undermining America with this surveillance.
Because the Biden administration fails to see the paradox at the heart of Marxist-Leninist regimes like the CCP, which is that the more comfortable they get, the more aggressive that they get. And as we sort of chase their officials around the world in order to get a photo op, they continue their cyber and economic war against the United States. In addition to the China Committee, I chair the Cyber Committee on the Armed Services Subcommittee. The cyber war for Taiwan is already underway by the CCP.
Congressman, you're doing a great job. We're watching everything. We appreciate your time this morning. Thank you, sir. Congressman Mike Gallagher, thank you for being here. Adam Johnson, Kelly O'Grady, and Todd Pyro. We'll see you again tomorrow. Morning Company.